I'm Mr. Black, and in this video I'm going to be discussing animal abduction cases. Ufologist Jacques Vallée received a letter from a young Frenchman by the name of Guy Forchet. He published it in his 1965 book, Anatomy of a Phenomenon. What's interesting is that it seems to document a seemingly failed abduction by non-earthly beings. It began on the afternoon of October 16, 1954, at Cieux de Revy in France. Guy Forchet, a farmer, was returning home from the fields with his horse, which he held onto by a bridle. Suddenly the animal began acting up. It appeared to Guy Forchet that his horse had been spooked by something. Just then, that something made itself known. A gray-colored object, shaped like a large pan with a diameter of 5 feet, rose up from behind some trees and bushes nearby. It climbed to an altitude of about 50 meters and then began coming towards them. It hovered directly above them, and then something terrifying happened. Guy Forchet's horse suddenly began lifting up into the air, as if being sucked up into the craft by some force. When it was about 3 meters off the ground, Guy Forchet let go of the rein. At that point, the object, for some reason, seemed to release its hold on the horse, which fell back to the ground with a heavy thud. Despite his attempts to revive the animal, it remained motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Whether the animal was stunned by the fall, or some sort of paralytic effect had been placed on it during the failed transport, it is not known, but the horse eventually recovered, albeit slowly. It was unsteady on its feet and trembled with fear during the long walk back home. The object didn't stick around to see the animal recover. Instead, it zipped off at a tremendous speed, disappearing out of sight within seconds. Guy Forchet claims that he felt nothing during the event. Whatever force the craft had employed to lift the animal, it did not seem to affect Guy Forchet, even though he was standing right next to it. That sort of selective transport reminds me of Star Trek's teleporter. This reminds me of another case that happened in New Mexico. On September 13, 1994, at around 4 p.m., near the small northern New Mexico town of Chicon, in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, carpenter Larry Gardia was hiking up Lujan Canyon to go bear hunting when he stumbled upon a dead, mutilated cow laying near some aspens just off the trail. He moved closer to inspect it and discovered that the tongue had been completely removed, along with the tissue and hide from the jaw. He also noticed that the rear end appeared to have been cored out. The cuts looked clean and new, not the work of animals, and he began to get an eerie feeling. Just then he noticed a second cow that was down. It did not seem to be mutilated. As he examined this second carcass, a strange noise suddenly filled his ears. It was a loud electrical sounding noise that seemed to be revving up and growing increasingly louder. Later, Gardia compared it to the sound an arc welding torch would make. The rest of the herd began running down the hill away from the sound, and Gardia then noticed another downed cow on the other side of the fence line, being dragged backwards up the hill toward the apparent location of where the sound was coming from. Speaking to researcher Linda Moulton Howe, Gardia described the obviously frightened, struggling animal as making a sound like it was being tortured while being dragged. Gardia could not believe his eyes when the cow suddenly began to float above the ground, over a shallow trench, in the direction of the sound, which was at the top of the hill, obscured behind a grove of trees. After being dragged about 150 feet, the bellowing cow disappeared behind the cover of the aspen trees. Gardia, now completely and utterly terrified, raised his hunting rifle and fired a shot in the direction of the aspen trees where the cow had disappeared. At that exact moment, the loud electrical revving noise suddenly stopped, as if somebody had flipped a switch. Gardia found himself alone in complete silence, wondering if he was next. He admits that he became freaked out and made a mad dash back to his vehicle. He left the area and raced over to the sheriff's office to report the strange event he had just witnessed. To their credit, the sheriff's office took his report seriously, and a deputy was dispatched to the area to investigate. The deputy and Gardia returned to the spot at the base of the canyon, where they found the mutilated cow laying where Gardia had seen it. They examined the area but found no tracks to indicate that a cow had been dragged up the hill, nor did they find any trace of a cow at the top of the hill. Gardia was positive that the sound source was somehow dragging the animal, and although they didn't find any tracks, they did discover numerous broken branches, which seemed to indicate that something had indeed been dragged up and through the trees. Interesting to note that prior to this happening, on September 10th, residents living around the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had reported sightings of a strange aerial object. As well, other mutilated animals had been found in the area in recent weeks. On January 12, 1997, between Cagua and Jamaica, Puerto Rico, at around 2:30 a.m., Pedro Vieira, a retired police officer, was returning home on Route 40 when he spotted a strange, disc-shaped object hovering over a field. It appeared to be levitating a bull off the ground up into the interior of the craft. Vieira likened it to a tractor beam. He watched in horror as the bull passed through an aperture on the bottom of the saucer, eventually disappearing from sight. The object then began moving away from the area. As a former police officer, Vieira found himself compelled to investigate. He immediately stepped on the gas pedal and began to give chase, racing down Route 40, keeping the strange object in his sight. Suddenly, a late model 4x4 pickup truck appeared out of nowhere and forced him to the side of the road. At this point, two men in black military BDU uniforms emerged from the truck and walked over to his car. One of the men began to speak to Vieira. He told me to let them do what they were doing. At first, Vieira didn't understand what he meant. Then he realized he was talking about the saucer. These two men, somehow, were connected to this strange craft. He watched them turn around, get back into their truck, and drive off. Vieira looked around, but the object was gone. Tired and a little spooked, Vieira decided to head home. Curiously, some 5 hours later, at around 7 a.m., several locals found a mutilated cow on Route 40, some distance from where Vieira had sighted one being lifted into the craft. Those on the scene noted that the animal looked as if it had been dropped from a considerable height. Was it the same cow that Vieira had seen the night before?